y'all. I am just finishing up a piece. It is about the kind of narratives that have been going around for the last couple of years in the news. There's been articles, there have been columns about the idea that people are starting to make decisions related to dating around political affinity. And in the process of writing this, it dawned on me that I might be able to shed a little bit of light on some things related to being neurodivergent. And so I thought I would just make a video and do that. It doesn't really have a place specifically in the piece that I'm writing. So what I kind of want to talk about is in the process of this piece, they go and they talk to a person named Daniel Cox, who is a senior fellow in polling and public opinion at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative-leaning Washington think tank. And what I want to talk about a little bit is, there's a lot in the ether kind of in our public discussion about like autism and neurodivergence and communication, like the way that the neurotypical world or the default, the way that we understand communication can be difficult for people who are neurodivergent. And there is in here a couple of things that I think are really instructive about that. And I know this because whether you realize it, whether you know it or not, I'm autistic. And so I can highlight my experience with this kind of thing. And number one, I think that will be a decent example that might help people who aren't neurodivergent kind of understand the experience a little bit. And I think also it demonstrates something useful that we can contribute that we're not often given credit for because of the way that it works in a social context. And so this article is basically kind of a very short, superficial investigation of why it seems like younger people are starting to make decisions about dating related to political affinity. And this Daniel Cox guy from the American Institute, they go to him and they kind of ask, and they're asking him kind of what's going on here. And he says, we do know from some of our past research that younger people are more inclined to seek out that information. A lot of people in previous generations, they report that they didn't even know the politics of the person they were dating for a good long time because it just wasn't as relevant as other information. Do you belong to the same church? What kind of work do you do? Right? And those two last questions, he's positing as the things that were more important to previous generations than like direct political affinity, right? So there's a whole bunch of assumptions behind that from a kind of conservative standpoint. But that's kind of beside the point of this video and kind of what I'm talking about. So the example that I want to kind of give is that when I hear those questions, as somebody who is autistic, and specifically in the context of somebody that is new to me, right? So if I am, and that can be dating, it can be just a social situation where, I don't really know somebody very well. I don't have enough context, right? So do you belong to the same church? There are like a bunch of assumptions behind that question. First of all is the assumption that the person that you're asking belongs to any kind of community of religious worship, period, right? So there's that assumption. Second, church, right? Do you belong to the same church? that is a specific religious community, right? Christians are the ones who go to churches for the most part. There are a few others who will call it church, but there's synagogue, there's mosques, there's temple, there's a whole other, like there are a bunch of other religious affiliations that call their places of worship something different, right? So if I hear a question like that in society, just in kind of everyday life and meeting somebody new, I am trying to figure out what's the actual question you're asking me, right? Now, to the person who asked this question, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Even if they don't say the same church, do you belong to a church? Or what church do you belong to, right? And these are the kinds of questions I've been asked at different points. And like, I'm not hearing one question. You understand? I'm hearing like 5 questions. And I am trying to figure out which one of those questions are you actually asking? And especially if it's somebody new and I don't have the context to know a little bit more about them, I don't know which question they're asking. Number one. Number two, my experience has also been that oftentimes asking clarifying questions is insulting, right? People get insulted by the idea, because they're understanding the question I'm asking in a specific way, right? Yeah. So then, like, what kind of work do you do, right? Okay, that again also can be a bunch of different questions. So that can be just a kind of investigative, exploratory question, right? In the context of like dating, which is what it is in the article, it can be a question of like, what does your daily life look like? And does your daily life fit in with my idea of how and if you are a person that I might be able to gradually integrate into my life more, right? That is in a practical, what does your daily life actually look like, right? If you work nothing but like overnights and I work nothing but days, what is the likelihood we're going to be able to actually like make that work out, right? That's a very practical question in that way of asking the question. What kind of work do you do can also be a question about what kind of money you make, right? And that is a question that has values attached to it. The question of whether or not you are going to be willing to date somebody based on how much money they make is has values attached to it, right? That is a set of values. Yeah. And then there is what kind of work do you do in the question of like, what kind of contribution are you making to society and the world, right? It can be that question too. It can be all of these questions. It can be any of these questions. And if I don't really know you well enough to understand what question you're asking, I'm sitting there trying to understand which question you're asking. And now I know this because of my experience with people and because of my experience with people reacting very poorly to me answering the wrong question, right? To me either answering the wrong question or asking a clarifying question, right? And so this is, I think, for a lot of people who are neurodivergent, for maybe especially autistics, this is a thing that we experience like constantly. Like especially in like new situations with people we don't know, and that is where this anxiety comes from with changes in routine and things like that. So this idea like about these questions and the fact that like so many questions they may seem simple, but they can actually be like a bunch of different questions, right? depending on who's asking it, the context, all of that. So here's one of the ways that that shows up in other parts of life. So say you're new at a job, right? Being new at a job is going to involve asking a bunch of different questions, right? Now, if my clarifying questions, right? So say in a day, I ask 3-4 different clarifying questions, right? I'm trying to get in a little bit closer to find out, what are you actually asking here? What are you asking me to do? What is this thing, right? I'm just trying to clarify, trying to understand a little bit better. Now, because of the way that a lot of neurotypical communication works, if I'm asking a clarifying question, I ask 4 a day for the first 5 days that I work there, right? And 2 of those questions a day are responded to with that kind of, like, they're not understanding the question that I'm asking, right? They're hearing a different question than I'm asking. I have learned to try my best to be pretty specific when I ask so that there isn't miscommunication, but that doesn't always matter, right? The fact that I'm asking a clarifying question itself is oftentimes misunderstood as a challenge. It can be a bunch of different things, but it's just the fact that there is a clarifying question that you all, a lot of times you're like, why are you doing that? What is that? So if my clarifying question, say, like I said, I'm asking 4 of them in every day in 5 days, right? And on 2 of those occasions, you get that kind of ick, right? What does that mean for the way that people perceive me from there on out, right? How long does it take for me to recover from the way that perception is formed at the beginning, right? You understand? I've only had one job. I've had a lot of different jobs. I've only had one where that was not the case, where I did not run into instances of asking questions or asking clarifying questions that were not responded to with some kind of negativity or some kind of feeling that, I was somehow out of pocket, right? And that is just the way that it works for those of us who are kind of neurodivergent and wandering around in society. And so the other side of that, there is a positive about this, right? Because like I am going through and looking at this piece that was written about this dating thing, and I see all of the assumptions that are being made. Maybe not all, but I see a lot of them. And so when we're talking about, in the broader context, what's going on in the country and why are we so polarized and all of these kinds of things, and what's going on with our media environment, I can point to, and I think a lot of us who are neurodivergent can point to, well, these are all the places that you all are communicating in this way that is not really very clear, or that is making assumptions that are very different depending on the context of the person who is hearing the question and the person who is asking the question, right? And that these assumptions that are often made especially in our media, our news, they are just that. They are assumptions. And so we can kind of speak to the miscommunications that are happening, and we can speak to the way that narrative can be used. What I really have started to focus on is like speaking to the way that narrative is used to kind of hide ideas and to kind of and that the like shortcuts, what they cut out, right? The things that are assumed in them. And I think there's value in that, right? When we're looking at our information environment right now, and especially with the explosion of fucking AI, uh, it's very, very hard to make sense of what's going on. It's very, very hard to even oftentimes make sense of what people are saying. And I think there is value in people who are neurodivergent being able to look at and break down what's going on in those specific communications themselves, because they are indicative of these other patterns. And so when there are people like RFK out there talking about us like we're some kind of, mutants who need to be excised from the gene pool, and people like Jenny McCarthy who hate their children so much because they are neurodivergent or autistic or whatever, that they want to find a way to make sure that they don't exist anymore. That's part of what's going on, and it erases the contribution that we can make, you know. And it's not just in like news and communication. This, processing information differently actually helps us solve problems broadly, right? Because somebody asks a new question or asks a question differently, right? That's important. That's how we get to new decisions. And we pretty clearly need to make some new decisions because things are not good. So, that's pretty much it. I hope you had a happy New Year's Eve. I hope your 2026 is way better than 2027 has been for most of us. But that's pretty much it.